I'm going to tell you guys a story today about two ships that somehow crashed directly into each other in the middle of the wide open Atlantic Ocean. A story about a series of mistakes and bad moves made by both crews. A story about the beauty and opulence of Italian design and styling that left a couple of big holes in a ship's ability to stay afloat. And while one of those mighty ships can only be seen at the bottom of the ocean, the other one continued service for some 70 years. It was attacked by pirates. It was arrested during COVID and is still for sale right now. This week on Historsea, the sinking of the Andrea Doria. It's the late 1940s and World War II had just finally come to an end, with Italy reeling from the loss of most of its merchant ships during the war. The country was war-torn and struggling to get its economy back into full swing. The partially state-owned Italian Line, this is a shipping company, ordered two brand new cruise ships that would be built with the aim of crisscrossing the Atlantic with passengers and tourists. It was an investment in not only the shipping industry, but one to bring back tourism of people coming back over to Italy after a very ugly war. The goal of these two new ships wasn't to be the biggest or the fastest Atlantic crossing ships, setting any records by any means, but instead to be the pride of Italy, beautifully designed, looking more modern and stunning than anything else on the sea in the 50s. The wartime ships that people were used to seeing were sort of squared off with no sweeping lines, so these two new ships would be focused heavily on showing what Italy could do when they put their minds to it. The finest Italian designers and artists set to work in 1950 when construction began. And the first ship would be completed would of course be called the Andrea Doria, and her sister ship not far behind would be the Christopher Colombo. The Italians weren't messing around with luxury on the Andrea Doria, hiring a famous architect, Giulio Minoletti, to furnish the ship with the utmost opulence, spending as much as $1 million on the artwork alone, just the stuff they're going to hang on the walls. And when fully loaded, the ship would be capable of accommodating over 1,200 passengers, 218 in first class, 320 in cabin class, and 703 in tourist class. As was the rule aboard transatlantic passenger liners, each passenger class was strictly segregated for specific parts of the ship. First class accommodations were located amidship on the upper deck, the highest tier and most expensive. Cabin class accommodations were located just aft of first class. In tourist class, the lesser of them all, their accommodations were divided between the bow and the stern ends of the ship, and everything was connected by corridors that ran the full length of the ship. Each class had its own separate dining room, its separate lounges and social halls and bars, and designated areas of open deck space and enclosed promenades, and even their own swimming pools with verandas, but they weren't allowed in each other's pools, so there were 3 different pools. Each class had to stick to their own. A crew of 563 people was on board the new luxury liner and enjoying the first ship to be fitted entirely with air conditioning, the whole ship. She weighed 29,000 tons and was 700 feet long, with a beam of 90 feet. This is a huge ship, and she may not have been the biggest on the Atlantic, but she was massive, almost the size of the Titanic in total. But learning from the Titanic, she did have some safety features that we might not have thought of 40 years earlier. The ship had 11 watertight compartments, and it was believed on paper that if any 2 of those compartments were breached and filled with water, the vessel should be able to stay afloat. She also had more than enough lifeboats on board for all of the people, and she was fitted with the latest in radar technology, the stuff we had just learned in World War II. The Andrea Doria was thought to be one of the safest ships on the water. She made her maiden voyage on January 14th, 1953, departing from Genoa, Italy, finally landing on the other side of the ocean in New York City. And that would kind of be her stomping ground, crisscrossing back and forth across the Atlantic with style and luxury accommodations for the next 3 years, successfully completing 50 Atlantic crossings without any incident. Historsea is a brand new channel. I'd like to thank everybody who has subscribed so far. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It's free for you and it would really mean the world to me. The next ship we're going to talk about today may not have sunk on its 51st voyage, but it hadn't had the easiest life. The MS Stockholm was known to be one of the most reliable passenger vessels on the sea, but she was kind of small in the standards of the day in the 1950s. The Stockholm was operated by the Swedish-American line, and at just some 12,000 tons and a measly 525 feet long, she was less than half the size of the Andrea Doria, but she was specifically built for a purpose, to make North Atlantic crossings in her early years, and built with a reinforced icebreaker bow. She was specifically designed to smash through the ice in the North Atlantic. I think you can see where this is going. The Stockholm was scheduled to leave New York on July 25th, 1956, bound for her home port in Sweden. She was also a passenger cruise liner with over 700 people aboard, and also a heavy focus on a luxury interior with luxury appointments, and she had made many successful Atlantic crossings herself. She set out of the New York harbor in good weather and good visibility. The Andrea Doria was on the other side of the ocean in Genoa, Italy, and had set out toward New York a few days earlier, so the ships were due to meet in the Atlantic, as many ships do as they make that crossing. But the Andrea Doria got into a heavy fog as she got closer to the US and the Gulf Stream, which brings warm water up from the tropics. When that warm water in the Gulf Stream meets the colder climate in the North Atlantic, it often produces a predictable fog over the ocean. This was fairly common and not the first time the Andrea Doria would have to encounter this particular problem. This is where the problems began for the two ships. There's a shipping channel that runs across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to about Gibraltar and then back, and it's common for eastbound ships to stay at the bottom or south side of the channel, and westbound ships to stay at the top or the north side of the channel. Think about the dividing line in the middle of the road. This way they can crisscross each other safely, always passing port side to port side or left side to left side. And there's always been a worldwide regulation too that when two ships are heading for each other head on, both ships are to turn right, putting space between them for a port side to port side passing. But the Stockholm was taking a bit of a shortcut on her way back to Sweden. To save time, the Stockholm was running some 20 miles north of where she should have been, well north into the north side of the channel that she shouldn't have been on. Basically, she was driving on the wrong side of the road to try and cut a little bit up towards Sweden. Now, this happens from time to time for a lot of different reasons, and it shouldn't lead to an accident. You could be avoiding weather or avoiding collision with something. As long as everybody is paying attention and watching their radar, as they should, and everyone remembers to turn right if they're head on with another ship, everything should be okay. The Andrea Doria was some 200 miles away from the New York harbor on her side of the shipping channel where she was supposed to be when she reached the heavy fog, and the captain started following the procedures that he was supposed to follow. First, you reduce speed. He did so, but only slightly, from its full cruising speed at 23 knots to a slightly slower 21 knots. He then ordered, as he should, that all of the watertight bulkheads and doors on the boat be closed and latched, as is the process. He also started sounding the ship's fog whistle so that anybody within earshot of the Andrea Doria would know that she was there, even if they couldn't see her. Still steaming along at 21 knots through the dense fog, he took note of a contact on the ship's advanced radar system. The Andrea Doria had the latest and greatest radar, and tracking the contact, he identified it as another ship, but no effort was made to make radio contact with the other ship. the next mistake. Back on the Stockholm, they had been steaming along at full speed, albeit 20 miles north of where they should have been, and well into the westbound shipping lane, and they started to reach that dense fog. As the Stockholm started down the procedure list for dealing with those conditions, they noticed a contact on their radar. And it's believed at the time, however, that the radar operator on the Stockholm had made a mistake. You see, radar has a range setting for how far it looks out ahead of you at sea, and you'd expect to use the very highest setting to see as far as you possibly can if you're going to be in the middle of the ocean. So it was assumed to be set at the highest setting. So when he saw the contact, he thought it was further out than it was, some 12 miles out. However, the Stockholm's radar was set much tighter as if they were still in the harbor, and the contact was actually only 5 miles out. The Stockholm took action, turning hard to the south to get back on her side of the channel and out of the way of whatever that contact might be that was coming toward them. Turning right is obviously the correct move for a port-to-port passing with another vessel. But this is where the next mistake was made. Back on the Andrea Doria, they saw the radar contact getting closer and closer in the dense fog, and at present speed they needed to take action, so they turned hard to the south. The wrong way for a port-to-port passing. The two ships were now on a direct collision course and at speed had no way to stop. At 11:10 p.m., under the pitch-dark Atlantic sky, through the dense fog, the crew and passengers of the Andrea Doria saw it for the first time. The bow of another cruise liner bearing straight down onto their starboard bow. With both ships doing some 20 knots, the closing speed was almost 40. Impossible to stop. The Stockholm plowed into the side of the Andrea Doria with all 12,000 of her tons of energy, smashing through the hull. The Andrea Doria, being more than twice the weight, didn't fall off and deflect the energy. She just took the hit and crumpled under the pressure. A 14-year-old girl, a passenger on the Andrea Doria, was asleep in her bed. She was in a cabin up at the front right, where the Stockholm smashed into them. She was later found to have been thrown from her bed while sleeping, landing on the deck of the Stockholm, and later she was called the Miracle Girl in the newspaper headlines. Imagine switching ships from your bed while sleeping. The Stockholm fell back and revealed the damage to her bow, crushing it back, but she was still afloat. The captain and crew immediately took to assessing the damage, but things were far worse on the Andrea Doria. The collision had not only ripped open one of the watertight bulkhead compartments, so she should have been able to stay afloat, but there were other problems and another mistake to uncover, a design issue that was sort of ignored by the crew. The Andrea Doria had massive fuel tanks on either side of the hull, and she was nearing the end of her journey in New York, so a lot of those tanks were empty, particularly the tanks on the port side had been completely emptied, and the starboard side tanks where the Stockholm hit were nearing empty. In the design of the boat, focusing on luxury and beauty and sweeping lines, the design left the boat relatively unstable and very susceptible to rolling from side to side. As such, the designer specified to the company that was having the boats built that when a fuel tank was emptied, it was immediately to be flooded with seawater to add weight and ballast and thus make the ship more stable. And if you know anything about engines, you're already thinking what I'm thinking, of what a problem this would be. If there's water in your fuel later, it can severely damage your engine because it won't compress. So if you empty a fuel tank of fuel and do what the designers say to do, flooding the tank with seawater, you have the very time-consuming and expensive process of getting all that seawater out of the tank the next time you refuel. So with its empty portside tanks, the crew never flooded them with seawater, so they were full of air. When the Stockholm smashed into the starboard side fuel tanks, they got flooded with a rush of seawater all of a sudden, while the port side tanks were full of air. The Andrea Doria immediately began to list or lean over to starboard, and at first it was okay. She could handle a list of 15 degrees in total before the water would be able to flood over the decks and into all the other watertight compartments. But with the full water tanks on one side and full tanks of air on the other, she listed to over 20 degrees. As a sailor and someone who races sailboats quite a lot, I can tell you that 20 degrees is a tremendous amount of heel. Just trying to walk on the boat at this angle is near impossible, so I can only imagine the chaos and fear on board for the crew and the passengers at that much of a list. The heavy list immediately put the ship in extreme danger of sinking, so the abandon ship order was given, but this led to another problem. The ship was listing so hard that the high side, the port side lifeboats couldn't be launched because they would just hit the side of the hull and roll over upside down. The starboard side lifeboats could be launched, but only right down to water level to be boarded, not high above the water where they're supposed to be boarded. This would mean getting the 1,700 passengers on board down to water level on a ship leaning at 20 degrees now. Distress calls from both the Stockholm and Andrea Doria littered the radio waves and were heard far and wide from a whole bunch of other ships and the U.S. Coast Guard. But in the moment, they had to rely on themselves and save as many people as they could. In the black night and heavy fog, the Andrea Doria launched what lifeboats that she could. On the Stockholm, they assessed the ship to still be floating and safe for the moment, so they launched their own lifeboats to go rescue the Andrea Doria's passengers. The boats from each ship went back and forth for hours, ferrying people to the moderate safety of the Stockholm. Terrified passengers were ferried to the Stockholm, passing by its horribly smashed-in bow in the dark hours, until something else appeared that gave a final breath of relief to everyone. A massive ship with all of its lights on approached the two wrecked ships, and it was the Ile-de-France, another cruise liner. The Ile-de-France was a massive cruise ship built in World War I era and positioned herself upwind of the heavily heeling Andrea Doria to block the waves and wind that were making the rescue operation more difficult. Now, in the lee of the Ile-de-France, the lifeboats would have an easier time ferrying passengers, and the Ile-de-France itself took on some 750 passengers, the largest role played in the rescue operation. Other ships came too, other passenger ships and cargo freighters. And just 200 miles out of New York, there were a lot of ships in the area, so within a few hours, a lot of ships on scene. The next morning, as the sun broke, the full damage of the night before came into view. And although being 1953, a lot of footage exists of the wreck. By now, several helicopters were flying overhead, and other ships had surrounded the wreck, but any effort to save her would be fruitless. As she listed more and more, they watched as the water came over the top of the decks, through the windows and into the interior, and as she filled with seawater and she rolled fully onto her starboard side under the immense weight, she began to sink. Historsea is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to make these videos possible. If you get some value from these videos and you want to help out, please consider becoming a patron. By 10 a.m. the next morning, the Andrea Doria slipped beneath the surface forever, right in front of all her passengers as they watched from the other ships that had rescued them. Almost all the passengers watched, as 51 of them had lost their lives in either the initial collision or injuries that they sustained within that collision. 46 from the Andrea Doria and 5 from the Stockholm were lost in the accident. It was the first major maritime accident since the sinking of the Titanic 41 years earlier, and the rescue ships began the 200-mile trek back to New York, the nearest safe harbor to the accident, to ferry the survivors back to solid ground, which would probably be much appreciated at that point. And the docks in New York were swarmed with radio and newspaper reporters, as well as the loved ones of people who were on board, not knowing the fate of the passengers, just knowing that some of them had died. Assisted by the American Red Cross and some news photographers, the frantic parents of a 4-year-old girl, Norma DeSandro, searched for their young daughter who didn't come off any of the rescue ships. They waited and waited, and there was no sign of her. As they panicked, they asked other survivors and the crew from all the rescue ships if they had seen 4-year-old Norma, but no one had. until they learned that she was injured in the accident, and instead of coming back on one of the ships, she was airlifted off of the ship by a helicopter and flown back to the US in a medical emergency. They learned that she had suffered a fractured skull and was airlifted to the hospital in Boston. So they arranged a convoy of cars to go with them, and they drove all night from New York to Boston with police escorts most of the way. Arriving in Boston, they found her in the hospital, unconscious from the surgery, and the doctors had grim news explaining that they didn't know if she would wake up or not. A few hours later, little Norma succumbed to her injuries, becoming the last casualty of the crash. The pier in New York, where Stockholm was heading, was packed with newsreel photographers and television crews. All the major department stores in New York had shown up as well, and the shoe stores. And they had booths that they had set up to give the arriving survivors clothing and shoes. Not many of the news people there spoke Italian, so a lot of confusion occurred when the survivors, who had just received new clothes, dry clothes, and shoes, were asked to take the clothing off so that they could be photographed putting the clothing back on. Everybody wanted their piece in the limelight there because they donated clothes. But everyone got clothes and shoes to wear nonetheless. And the sinking produced an interesting footnote in the automotive history, as it resulted in the loss of the Chrysler Norseman, an advanced one-off prototype car that had been built for Chrysler by Ghia in Italy. The Norseman had been announced as a major attraction in the 1957 auto show. However, it had not been shown to the public yet, and in the disaster was lost, along with all the other cars in the Andrea Doria's 50-car garage. Several months of hearings were held in New York in the aftermath of the collision. Prominent maritime attorneys represented both of the ship's owners. Dozens of attorneys represented the families of the victims. Officers on both ships had testified, including officers in charge at the time when the collision occurred, with more scheduled to appear later. But an out-of-court settlement was reached, kinda quietly, and all the hearings abruptly ended. In the end, both shipping lines contributed to a financial settlement fund for the victims. Each line absorbed its own damages. For the Swedish-American line, damages to the Stockholm were estimated at about $2 million, half for the Stockholm's bow and half for the loss of business while she was down for repairs. The Italian line, however, sustained the loss of the entire Andrea Doria, its full value, estimated to be about $30 million in the 50s. A U.S. congressional hearing was also held and provided some determinations, notably about the lack of ballasting specified by the builders during the fatal voyage and the resulting lack of seaworthiness of the Andrea Doria because of it. Well, heavy fog was given as the primary reason of the accident, and it's not disputed that intermittent heavy fog are both frequent and challenging conditions for mariners in that part of the ocean. These other factors have been cited. Andrea Doria's officers had not followed proper radar procedures or used the plotting equipment that was made available to them. They had also not consulted with the captain properly on the radar contact that they were seeing. The Andrea Doria had also not followed the long-established rule that vessels approaching head-to-head must both turn right or to starboard. As the Stockholm turned to starboard properly, Andrea Doria turned to port, closing the circle instead of opening it. Beyond a certain point, it became impossible to avoid the collision because of that decision. The captain of the Andrea Doria was also found to be deliberately speeding in a heavy fog, an admittedly common thing to do on these passenger liners. The navigation rules required that the speed be reduced during periods of limited visibility to a stopping distance within half of the distance of visibility. But that's not what he did. He reduced speed a little bit, but still doing 21 knots. It was utterly impossible for him to stop in time. Another thing cited were the Andrea Doria's fuel tanks not being filled with seawater once they were empty to stabilize the ship in accordance with the Italian line's procedures and the people who built the boat. This contributed to the pronounced list following the collision and the inability for the crew to pump the water out of the port fuel tanks to right the ship, and the inability to use the portside lifeboats to evacuate people. Also, it was cited that there was a watertight door that may have been missing in one of the bulkheads near the engine room of the Andrea Doria, which was thought to have contributed to the problems. Stockholm's navigating officer misread the radar, thinking he was on a 15 nautical mile setting when the radar was actually set to 5 nautical miles. Thus, he thought the Andrea Doria was much further away than she actually was. He also failed to consult his captain, which is a required regulation when there's a contact. The Andrea Doria Stockholm collision led to several rule changes in the immediate years following this incident to avoid something happening like that again. Since this was essentially a radar-assisted collision event in which overuse was made of poorly handled technology, shipping lines were required to improve training on the use of radar equipment. Also, approaching ships are required to make radio contact with each other, which these two didn't do. Both ships saw each other on radar systems and attempted to turn to avoid collision, but never bothered to pick up the radio. Ultimately, one of the radar systems was poorly designed, resulting in the collision. Marine craft today are required to turn to starboard or the right in a head-on situation. As a sailor of the Atlantic and longtime seaman myself, this story is both heartbreaking and terrifying, and prompted a lot of private vessels, like mine, to run radar, even though we're not required to, and to run AIS radio equipment to better avoid collisions in the dark or fog, because you can see the other ships on AIS and see their names and their speed and their heading, and you can radio them much more easily. But this remains a scary and fatal warning to all vessels, large and small. Don't tempt Mother Nature, and if it looks dangerous, be willing to swallow your ego and make the hard call to simply stay in port and wait for a better window. Please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and hit that subscribe button. Those things are free for you and they would really mean the world to me. That's it for this episode of Historsea, and I will see you next week.